The flames. History's greatest secret and key to a future where ships travel lifetimes to bring flames to new worlds. Those who dare to walk the fire can cross between the stars with a step if you can find a ferryman and pay your way across. For most who brave the flame alone are lost forever. May the ferryman take you. Crucible and Flame. Written and narrated by John Miro. 1. Strive all your days to bring the divine into this world, and as surely as you toil for the divine, the ferryman will bring you home safe from all your journeys, and at the end of all your days. The Book of Flame, Psalm 2. The fire licked hungrily, and the ferryman walked. He thought of his first crossing to the place, the stink of burnt plastic and corroded metal, the antiseptic smell of old, poorly filtered air, and the brown paint flecks across everything as he willed them across the space between the flames. Heat kissed his face, and then he strode through onto echoing metal grating, pulling his passenger through by the crook of his arm. The roar of applause met his ears before his eyes adjusted to the gloom of the large, dark space. Then the canned smell of a generation ship hit his nostrils, the reek of too many bodies, too many deodorants, and too little bathing. Not exactly dirty, but close enough. The ferryman donned his plastic smile and held his arms wide as the metal walls and gantries, the retracted cranes and hooks of the utilitarian space defined themselves, and defined the elated masses crammed within. On the floor ahead and a story above, covering walkways to either side, dressed in their ragged Sunday bests, were the people of Ship 227. He waved to them as the welcoming party made their way to the dais. He didn't recognize anyone, of course. It had been 80 years since he'd last made the trip, during a surprise economic upswing. He had brought a trade delegation then, too. Something about the ship's centuries-old computer components suddenly being valuable enough to bring to auction. Now, only 30 years distant from their target world, the odds of the ship's survival and arrival had ticked up, and business would now tick up again, too, as investors came calling to buy a stake in the prize waiting for the ship just one generation ahead. A small man, short and thinly built, with a fringe of white hair, began to climb the dais. He wore a red tender stole with orange and gold embroidered flames, and held his hands in front of him as if cupping an imaginary flame. Draped over his arms was a ferryman's cloak. Wonderful. He had known there was a church on this hulk, but he'd been told the crew wasn't devout. He truly hoped they weren't, and if they were, he hoped they at least knew their place and stayed out of his way. His passenger scowled and tapped his foot. The tender was observing the ritual, slowly. The ferryman wanted to do the same, to tap his foot and all, but kept the plastic smile upon his face. He hoped this was just a spectacle to entertain the crew, a touch of celebration to brighten what had to be the most dreary of existences. He struck a heroic pose and waited, the right side of his face turned away from the crowd. Some things even ferrymen had to endure. At the top of the dais, the tender turned and raised his hands to each of the gantries full of people. The applause died in moments, leaving only the guttering of the flame behind them and a deep, palpable silence. "Rejoice, for the divine is with us today," he called. The crowd parroted the line back to the tender, and the ferryman fought not to roll his eyes. "We welcome his voice and his hand, and give thanks for the flame that warms us, each of us this day and all days." The ferryman cast his eyes through the crowd, doing his part in the routine, forcing his face, through centuries of practice, into a passable expression of divine grace. People held their hands out. Some raised their children in their arms toward the flames. There were cries of joy and religious ecstasy. Then mercifully the old fart bowed to the crowd, signifying the end of the ritual. He turned to the ferryman and bowed again. The ferryman knew what was asked of him and returned the bow, then turned back to the flame. It was already settling down from the bonfire his crossing had riled it into. The tender came closer, holding the traditional cloak with its deep hood and long draping arms open. It was the one part of the ritual the ferryman looked forward to. "Welcome, ferryman. I am Father Cable. Welcome to our home," he whispered, close behind the ferryman's shoulder. The ferryman didn't reply. He shrugged himself into the heavy canvas, closed the ornate metal clasps over the garb that eternally reappeared when he stepped out of a flame, and drew the hood down over his face. His plastic smile fell away the moment his face was hidden. His body and clothes were remade, he knew, reset down to the atom, and dressed exactly as he had been on that first crossing. He fought back the undying urge to touch the black shape once again inked into the side of his face. He fought the urge, and lost. He balled his hand into a fist, then let the cloak fall to cover it before he turned back to the crowd. Inside the shadow thrown by the cloak, free now to let the disdain he felt play on his face. He waited for the last piece of standard tender tripe, advising all who bask in the glory of the ferryman's presence not to touch or to come too close, for they should always remember that he was divine and they were small. The tender surprised him by walking silently down the stairs, beaming at his flock, walking into the crowd to clasp hands, hug them, and laugh with them. The ferryman would have preferred it if the tender had given the warning. Next, the captain led 227's delegation up the creaking, rusted steps to the dais. One by one they bowed as the applause thundered on once again. The captain removed his traditional cap, held it respectfully across his heart, and offered his hand. "Ferryman, Legal Critchlow, I'm Captain Columbus Dietrich. It's an honor to welcome you aboard our—" The ferryman was halfway through his automatic bow, again wearing his plastic smile, when his passenger stepped forward, ignoring the captain's hand. "Let's get to it. Goloban Corp wants an exclusive trade window, Captain. I've been given a list of what you need, and I've been authorized to—" Then they were moving, the delegation all slack-jawed and confused as the Goloban legal herded them. This hulk was a backwater, he could see that plain as day. Now they were close enough to the world they'd lit out for so many centuries ago to tick the right boxes, to bring the important people calling. How many isolated ships and planets with a resource supply long abandoned and suddenly made valuable again by some technology, or by getting close to whatever lay at the end of the rainbow, had he visited? His own honor guard closed in and escorted him along behind the delegation and out of the room. About time, too. He was itching to shed and burn his clothes, and run a dermal regenerator until his face was clean and bare again. Most of the dirty faces on the gantries above him would live and die on this ship, long before they made planetfall. Suddenly, the universe was calling on them, and for one moment, they all felt like the prize pig at the fair. He'd seen it more times than he cared to count, and it always turned out the same. The people who could afford what it cost for him to guide them safely through the flames, crossing solar systems, even galaxies, always got what they wanted. And, well, everybody knew what happened to the prize pig. The ferryman's lips curled. Like so many Captain Columbus whoever's before Dietrich, Ship 227 had no idea what had just hit them. Walk the Fire by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Theme music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Many of the stories you listen to at servingworlds.com were made possible by the support of patrons at patreon.com/servingworlds. If you like what you hear, please consider adding your support. Thank you for listening.